Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy in the modern world with the second installment, the reign of Pope St. Pius X. On February 14th, 1906, Pope Pius issued an instruction calling for children to receive communion. Prior to that time, First Communion had been given between the ages of 12 and 14, often in conjunction with confirmation. Pope Pius explained his reason for wishing children to receive at an earlier age in the following words: so that children be nourished by Christ before they are dominated by their passions, so they can with greater courage resist the assaults of the devil, of the flesh, and of their other enemies, whether internal or external. End quote. His hope was that by allowing children to start receiving the graces of the sacrament at an early age, frankly, before puberty, let's be, that coupled with correct moral formation, that children would be better equipped to overcome the many temptations with which they would be beset during adolescence and young adulthood. There was resistance to this and obstruction to Pius's wish for children to receive communion from, for example, catechism programs. Were worried that once the child received communion, that the family would stop bringing them to catechism instruction. Others feared that a young child would not understand the sacrament sufficiently to respect it, and would think nothing of spitting out the host or playing with the host. Still, others were infected with residual Jansenist sentiment, which regarded a child as incapable of the kind of penance and spiritual preparation necessary to receive the body of Christ. These three categories of opposition made it necessary for Pius to return to this issue later in his reign. But following the chronology, back to the situation in Europe, which is going to lead to the First World War. The strategic and tactical calculations of the world were all nullified on February 10th, 1906, when Great Britain launched the first modern battleship, named the HMS Dreadnought. It displaced 17,900 tons. At full steam, it could reach 21 knots. It was armed with 10 12-inch guns. Most importantly, why I say modern battleship, is that its hull was entirely steel. All the navies of the world were rendered obsolete instantly, requiring that all the nations who wished to retain the influence that came from the ability to project lethal force across the oceans had to build entirely new navies from scratch. So all the great powers had plans for such a vessel, all steel vessel, but none previously had constructed one because everyone understood that it would trigger an immediate and ruinously expensive arms race. Great Britain finally did the deed with full knowledge of the implications because of escalating tension with Germany. That was also a contributing factor, among many, to the First World War. Great Britain had been allied with the Kingdom of Prussia, which eventually united Germany. So Great Britain was uniting with the Kingdom of Prussia during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. That alliance was strained by Bismarck's wars of expansion to unite Germany. But the tension was attenuated by a marriage alliance between one of the daughters of Queen Victoria, who, just to confuse things, was also named Victoria, with the heir to the Prussian throne, heir to the throne of the Kingdom of Prussia, and therefore the heir presumptive to be the Kaiser, the next Kaiser of Russia, the Emperor of Germany. And he would inherit those. His name would be Frederick III. So they married. Frederick, the future Frederick III, married Princess, now Kaiserine Victoria. On January 27th, 1859, reproduction occurred, resulting in the birth of a male child who would become Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last Kaiser of the Second Reich. Wilhelm was a breech birth, meaning he was coming out the wrong way. Instead of coming out head first, he was coming out feet first. So that required the attending physician to insert forceps into the birth canal in order to turn the body around, to turn the baby around so that the delivery could take place head first. The physician bungled it, and no doubt, I mean inadvertently, but still, bungled it, and with the forceps dislocated one of the baby's shoulders, and did not set it after birth. I guess didn't notice it, or thought it would heal on his own, but for whatever reason it wasn't set. As a result, Wilhelm grew up with one of the arms crippled and shorter than the other. His mother, Victoria, being a daughter of the Queen Victoria, was obsessed with the public appearance of the heir to the throne. So growing up, from earliest childhood, she hammered into his head that he had to hide his infirmity with specially designed uniforms and carefully orchestrated public appearances. So she convinced him that if the public found out about his arm, that they would lose respect for him, and then because the German Empire was so new, that if they lost respect for him, then the dynasty would fall. This warped Wilhelm's emotional development from those early formative years, and he never got over it, such that he overcompensated and grew into an adult who was belligerent, ill-mannered, aggressive, and buffoonish. In 1888, the first Kaiser of the German Empire, Wilhelm I, died. So his son and heir inherited as Friedrich III. But Friedrich III, who was the one married to the daughter of Queen Victoria, was already in the final stages of throat cancer when he came to the throne. And in fact, he died before that year ended. So it was then his son who became Wilhelm II, Kaiser of the German Empire of the Second Reich. 2 years later, in 1890, an admiral in the United States, serving on the faculty of Annapolis, of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, published what he intended to be a textbook for the cadets, titled "The Influence of Sea Power on History." His name was Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, Mahan, lived from 1840 to 1914. The book articulates an argument that there had never been a great world power without a powerful navy, because a society can only survive with a strong economy, and a strong navy can interdict the economy of any nation that has a weaker navy. Well, Wilhelm read this. He was fluent in English, because his mother was had been an English princess, so he grew up speaking English. And so he read this book in the original, and this concept merged with Wilhelm's pathological insecurity, solidifying into a resolve that Germany must have the most powerful navy in the world. Only when that was accomplished could Germany have what he called its rightful place in the sun. Bismarck, who had been chancellor, was the under Wilhelm I, and then for the brief reign of Friedrich III, and so Wilhelm II inherited him, was still chancellor and foreign minister. Bismarck objected that such a policy was needlessly provocative, reminding the Kaiser that since it achieved unification, Germany had nothing to gain, and therefore could only lose from any future European war. And it was for this that Wilhelm fired Bismarck in 1890, with a cover story that he was retiring for his health. And Bismarck was elderly at the time. And then Wilhelm proceeded. He commenced with his naval building program. Now, that's something that could happen with the German monarchy that could not have happened with the English monarchy at the time, because at the time, even Queen Victoria, as famous as she was, and she did have more power than the current monarch, but even then, she could not have done something like this on her own without Parliament. But the way the Constitution of the Second Reich was, the German monarch, the German emperor could. So commencing this German naval building program, the problem was England. England had the largest navy in the world. The strategic policy of Great Britain was to keep the Royal Navy as large as the next two navies combined. This was not considered a threat by the other powers because in peacetime, England always kept a very small army. Germany, on the other hand, was the reverse. That Germany, prior to Wilhelm, did not need a large navy for its strategic security because its historic, rivals on the continent were Russia on one side, France on the other. Which he didn't need a navy to fight those. So all they needed was an army. So the balance of power was that Germany could have the strongest army, but that was not a world threat because prior to Wilhelm II, it had a small navy. England could have the largest navy, but that was not perceived as a world threat because it kept a small peacetime army. Wilhelm's naval building program upset this balance of power. And since England as an island absolutely did need a navy, they regarded Wilhelm's naval expansion as that could only be directed against us, against Great Britain at the time, because the United States wasn't in the picture yet as a world power. The industrial capacity of Germany was at least equal to England, and in some areas exceeded it. Germany had already used it to build the most advanced army in Europe, with a railway network, artillery, individual munitions, second to none. Further, the German military tradition had always been infantry and artillery, never naval. The German Navy prior to Wilhelm was really what we would think of as a Coast Guard. England and Germany then, prior to Wilhelm II, served as the fulcrum of the European balance of power. As long as England had the most powerful navy but a weak army, and Germany had the most powerful army but a weak navy, the balance remained. Because both sides knew that neither could just invade the other secretly, that they could only do it with a costly national mobilization, which, because that involved calling up, all the civilians, that could not be kept secret. So the other side would have time to prepare. This logistical necessity programmed in a natural breathing space into any diplomatic crisis, which for a century, since the Congress of Vienna after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, which for a century had provided sufficient time to prevent a world war from occurring. Now, Wilhelm's naval building program disturbed that. After 9 years of German naval expansion, England was seriously alarmed. That accounts for its decision to reset the navies of the world to zero by constructing and launching the Dreadnought in February of 1906. The atmosphere of fear which prompted this decision only fed into a worldwide panic, as every nation had to design and build all-steel battleships. I mean, at least all the powerful nations that had international navies if they wanted to maintain that. The stability of the balance of power had then, in 1906, was then replaced by a foreboding that the balance of power's time was past and no one knew what would take its place. When the First World War began in 1914, Great Britain had 28 dreadnoughts. Germany had 18, which is one reason that Germany would make the fateful decision to rely on the submarine during the war. I say fateful decision because that is what provoked the United States into entering the war in year 3, as we'll see in the next papal reign. Following year, 1907, July 3rd, Pope Pius X issued the second syllabus of errors, called Lamentabili. Recall the first was issued in 1864 by Pope Pius IX. This was the second. But in structure it was the same. It condemned 65 propositions of modernism. And that formed the background for Pius's most famous document, same year, but later in the year, September 8th, 1907, which was an encyclical titled Pascendi Domini Gregis, meaning feeding the Lord's flock. Subtitle, On the Doctrine of Modernists. Consisting of 58 sections, in which he identified modernism as, in his words, the synthesis of all heresies. So to summarize his reasoning, Renaissance anthropology, man is the measure of all things, an anthropology of pride, led to the Protestant movement, which from his perspective was a rebellion against the authority of the church, and replacing that obedience to church authority by exalting the individual conscience over the hierarchy's interpretation of Scripture and tradition. That led to rationalist deism and atheism, which exalted the individual intellect, the reason, relegating the divinity and faith to a construct of superstitious early man that was no longer needed. Those assumptions led to ecclesial corruption, which deconstructed the sacred books into literary accretions from antiquity, dismissing them as just works of ancient literature, not a sacred document, and dismissing the hierarchy as a construct, a contrivance of medieval monarchies for the purpose of social control. All of which closed the circle back at the beginning with a re-articulated anthropology of pride, seeking to remake the church according to the wishes of the individual. Individuals infected by modernist secular ideology, including atheism, socialism, communism, etc. The only reason, he said, that more damage had not been done is the inability of prideful modernist conceit to form a unified plan of action from their generalized concept of pride. So, his introduction from number 1. The office divinely committed to us of feeding the Lord's flock, so hence the title, has especially this duty assigned to it by Christ, namely, to guard with the greatest vigilance the deposit of faith delivered to the saints, rejecting the profane novelties of words and oppositions of knowledge falsely so called, Gnosticism. The number of the enemies of the cross of Christ has in these days increased exceedingly, who are striving by arts entirely new and full of subtlety to destroy the vital energy of the church, and if they can, to overthrow utterly Christ's kingdom itself. Skip down another exemplar quote from section 6. We begin then with the philosopher. Modernists place the foundation of religious philosophy in that doctrine which is called agnosticism. According to this teaching, human reason is confined entirely within the field of observable phenomena, that is to say, to things that are perceptible to the senses, and in the manner in which they are perceptible. It has no right and no power to transgress these limits. Hence, it is incapable of lifting itself up to God and of recognizing his existence, even by means of visible things. From this it is inferred that God can never be the direct object of knowledge. He must not be considered as a historical subject. Skipping down then. Historic atheism, which is a doctrine of positive denial, starting from ignorance as to whether God has in fact intervened in the history of the human race or not, they proceed in their explanation of this history to ignore God altogether, as if he really had not intervened. Yet it is a fixed and established principle among them that both science and history must be atheistic. And within their boundaries there is room for nothing but phenomena. God and all that is divine are utterly excluded. Let's see, and he goes on. Subjectivism. I'm looking for that. Former. I mean, you get the picture then. One result of Pascendi. So this is a comprehensive, at the level of a papal encyclical, condemnation of modernism defined in those terms. Modernism defined as atheism, fundamentally atheist. One result of this Pascendi, of this document, was that it infused new energy into the young clergy who were, not all of them, because some had been suborned, but into young clergy, the subset of young clergy who were disgusted by modernism and were sick of all of its attacks against the church. They felt it was about time that the church hit back. One of the priests who gave unity and direction to this sentiment was a Monsignor named Umberto Benigni, Benigni, who lived from 1862 to 1934. He was well known in ultramontane circles, which we would call conservative today, as he frequently published articles attacking modernists and pointing out the damage that modernism was doing to the church. His actual job was teaching church history at the diocesan seminary in Rome. In 1902, he received an appointment on the staff of the Vatican Secretariat of State, which put him in a position to contact like-minded priests all over the world. When Pascendi was promulgated, Benigni felt the time had come. He assembled his vast network of friends into a secret society to find and purge modernists who were parasiting off of the church, meaning those like some we've already covered, who many were clergy, who were making their living off the church, but were actively undermining it with modernist, rationalist, atheist, whatever ideology. They call their group, their secret society, the Sodalicium Pianum, the sodality or fellowship of Pius. Now, even though Pius X was Pope, they were actually referring to the Pius who, from their perspective, was already canonized, St. Pius V. Now, this Sodalicium Pianum was never a canonical entity. It was merely an informal association of like-minded priests who were serving the church in a way they felt was necessary and which they believed was justified by Pascendi. They managed to get dozens of priests condemned as modernist heretics. Some of those recanted their heresy when caught. Others refused and were excommunicated and just left the church. This Sodalicium continued in existence until the next Pope, Benedict XV, ordered it disbanded in 1921 because he believed the church needed to focus on healing after the First World War. Same year as, in 1907, back to the spiral to the First World War. Another diplomatic treaty was negotiated called the Triple Entente, creating an alliance, solidifying an alliance between England, France, and Russia against the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, which at the time controlled most of the Middle East, what we think of as the Middle East. In keeping with the fear and instability created by the naval arms race, here Bismarck's alliance system, now he was forced into retirement, so, he was gone. But as a result, only 1 year after the Dreadnought was launched, in the midst of the naval arms race, the Bismarck's alliance system was now transformed from a method of keeping the peace and the balance of power into an absolute assurance of war, that there would be two power blocks that would go to war. Same year, 1907, to Russia, where we are introduced to Yosef Vissarionovich Zhugashvili, better known by his Bolshevik communist code name Stalin, or Stalin, which is the Russian word for steel, who lived from 1879 to 1953. In 1907, he embarked on a life of crime, stealing 375,000 rubles in a bank heist. Well, it was a transport, so it was more of a train heist, but bank money, robbing funds of the bank, the state bank of Tiflis in Georgia, which was part of the Georgia's on the between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, part of Tsarist Russia, and then later part of the Soviet Union. So ethnically he was not Russian, but in terms of his citizenship, he was born in Tsarist Russia. He did this. He stole this money in order to support professional revolutionaries of Lenin's Communist Party, which means active, violent subversives. He was born in the Caucasus Mountains on the western side of the Black Sea. He wanted, initially thought, or my surmise is it was his family that wanted this, as a young man, destined him for the church, which in his context meant the Russian Orthodox Church. So he was sent to the seminary. He was expelled from the Russian Orthodox Seminary for disseminating Marxist propaganda among the seminarians, which of course is atheist. So after he was expelled, he then joined Lenin's Bolsheviks after the 1903 split in the Russian Social Democratic Party. The Bolsheviks were the violent revolutionary wing. Following year, 1908, June 29th. In terms of American church history, and I have a whole separate playlist on this, but this Pius X did it, so it fits. Pius X never trusted the United States. In his eyes, it was a Masonic contrivance masquerading as a Protestant republic, which claimed to observe constitutional separation of state. In Pascendi, he linked Americanism, which had already been condemned as a heresy by Leo XIII, with modernism, which he condemned as a synthesis of all heresies. So that made him even more wary. But on June 29, 1908, in a document titled Sapiente Concilio, he removed the United States from the authority of the propagation of the faith by changing the status of the country from missionary territory to ordinary territory, which meant that the bishops in the United States would be under the direct control of the papal curia and not filtered through the propagation of the faith. 1908, another step down in the spiral toward the First World War. Austria annexed, or shall we say, invaded and stole Bosnia-Herzegovina in southeastern Europe from the Ottoman Turks, who had stolen it centuries earlier. The significance of this being that Serbia, also in southeastern Europe, claimed that territory, claimed Bosnia-Herzegovina as part of Greater Serbia. This invasion precipitated a war scare in which Germany sided with Austria and Russia sided with Serbia. So because of the alliance systems, if mobilization had happened, the First World War would have started there in 1908. But war was averted by diplomacy. But from that point on, the Balkans were referred to as the Powder Keg of Europe. So the Balkans... This is not really a good... but no, hit the wrong button. There it is. Okay, so this has the, but this is all continuous in reality. So the Balkans refers to southeastern Europe. So here we have Italy and the Adriatic Sea. So the Balkans is on this side and then continues over here. So you see the countries, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, all that. There's southeastern Europe. Now, the reason it was called the Powder Keg of Europe is because Austria on one side and Russia on the other, both, and the Ottoman Empire to the south, all had ambitions on that territory. And that territory had changed hands multiple times over history, as all three of those powers made them essentially colonies, internal colonies in Europe. And in fact, that is the Powder Keg. That is where the First World War began. The Balkans, the name Balkans is named for a chain of mountains that runs through Bulgaria and Serbia. The Balkans is the term used to refer to what is essentially a peninsula of southeastern Europe between the Adriatic Sea and the Ionian Sea, and the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. It's all, surrounded by water. It's not an island, literally, but it's surrounded, on three sides by so much water that it is, one could consider it topographically a peninsula. So this places the following nations all in the Balkans: Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Greece, Macedonia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia. Each of those regions had its own culture, its own history, its own language, and its own ethnic pride. Added to the mix, it had been a continual influx of migrating and conquering peoples because it's a natural crossroads from east to west. By this context, by the early 20th century, late 19th into the 20th century, the Balkans had the same, had an analogous political status to the Middle East today. Everyone knew it was a source of tremendous potential danger, but no one knew what to do about it. Russia, Austria, and the Ottomans had engaged in warfare for control over the region for centuries, with the various territories changing hands multiple times. And as if this were not complicated enough, there existed within each of those areas, each of those ethnic groups, substantial movements for national sovereignty, independence, or in the parlance of the day, this idea that each ethnic group should have political independence was called national self-determination. This created an inherently unstable situation and was a breeding ground for radical movements of all kinds. Many of these groups, particularly the Marxists and the anarchists, fill the role that Islamic terrorists do today and employ their same tactics: arson, bombings, assassinations, what we would call terrorism. In the 19th century, they called it anarchism. Only in the Balkans, they used political ideology as their excuse for murder instead of religion. August 8th. Pius X issued a decree on the age of reception of Holy Communion, clarifying that all children who have attained the age of reason, which he defined as age 7, were eligible to receive communion. This was to respond to some of the objections made, to the previous document on reception of communion. And he responded in this one by citing the practice of antiquity in which when children began to receive baptism, and still the practice of the Eastern Rite, where children receive baptism, First Communion, and confirmation, all in the same ceremony shortly after birth, ideally within 8 days of birth. This reflected an understanding of the sacraments as conduits of grace, rather than the sacraments as rites of passage. And he viewed the rite of passage interpretation of the sacraments as a distortion. The decree, within the text of the decree, he closed further controversy on the subject, at least officially, by prohibiting further discussion. Said children can receive communion at age 7. Shut up about it and just do it. As a result, First Communion at the age of reason has become the norm in the Church, except in lands where it's physically impossible, where there are no priests to say Mass, because of persecution or scarcity. However, Parallel arguments continue regarding the proper age to receive the sacrament of confirmation because of similar confusion over its nature. Its true sacramental character is one of grace, sealing the entrance of a soul into the church. Yet there remains a substantial body of opinion which regards it as a rite of passage, or connected to it, a corollary to that, as a means of keeping adolescents in catechism programs or religious ed programs as long as possible. Same year, following month, September 1st, 1910, Pius issued a motu proprio titled Antistitium, meaning stand against, which was the oath against modernism. So sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. Pius X composed and then mandated that this oath be taken when a man enters major orders. Under the procedures of the day, there were 4 minor orders and 4 major orders. The first of the major orders was subdeacon, and it was at that point that a guy in training to be a priest, once he at the point of subdeacon is when he would make the commitment to celibacy. And then the next order would be deacon, then priest. And then some of those would be chosen to be bishops. Most would not, of course. But those are the 4 major orders at the time, prior to Vatican II. By his motu proprio Antistitium, Pius X added to subdiaconate a requirement that the individual take the oath against modernism. And that remained in place until after Vatican II, until Paul VI rescinded it at the time he eliminated minor orders and eliminated the subdiaconate in the early 1970s. Let's see. Skip that. I'll cover that in the American history class. 1911, October 10th. Far East, East Asia, to China, which is going to be involved in the Second World War, as we shall see in the reign of Pope Pius XII. But nothing just happens. Nothing just happens. So we introduce things here. In that year, on October 10th, 1911, there was a revolution in China, which resulted in the overthrow of the Manchu dynasty. The perceived collaboration of the Manchu dynasty with Western encroachments into China and with the massacre of Chinese during the Boxer Rebellion fueled Chinese nationalism. Periodic uprisings were suppressed, but the one which proved to be the beginning of the end for the Manchu was an army mutiny, a mutiny within the army that erupted on October 10th, 1911. The marshal sent to suppress it, Yuan Shikai, instead joined the nationalist. Then, abandoned by everyone, the child emperor, the last emperor, if you saw the movie, abdicated on February 12th, 1912. And he was not replaced, at least not within the context of a monarchy. So that is the end of the Manchu monarchy. And the monarchy as a form of government was replaced with the Republic of China. It was parliamentary in structure and established with Marshal Yuan Shikai serving as its first president. So Shikai lived from 1859 to 1916 and served as president from 1912 until 1916. Okay, a couple of things to remember. Some of this refers back to the late medieval, early modern period. But the Manchu, let's see, Manchu. The Manchu were not ethnically or culturally Chinese, even though they had been ruling China. The Manchu were from Manchuria. Which is north of China. I'm looking for it. Of course, the crease goes right through it. Anyway, all right. So the Manchuria is north of China. Completely different ethnic group, completely different history, completely different language. But they invaded China and took over, and they reigned for centuries. and so the indigenous Han Chinese were then, relegated to second-class status in their own country. The Manchu only succeeded because they exploited divisions within the Han Chinese. And over centuries, the Manchu, since they were foreigners in China, they were the Chinese dynasty that was most open and welcoming to other foreigners settling in China. And that led to the de facto division of China into spheres of influence by Japan, along with Western powers, who simply bribed Manchu officials into that. And the Manchu didn't care as long as they got their money, because it wasn't their people being exploited. It was the Han Chinese being exploited. So this overthrow by the nationalist, this means this is another, like China for the Chinese. So this is an ethnic nationalism as well as a political nationalism. Okay. In 1913, the Marshal and first president of the Republic of China, Yuan Shikai, had a rival nationalist leader assassinated. This triggered a period of civil strife that turned into another period of Chinese warlords. And that happened multiple times in Chinese history. And of course, it's the Chinese who suffered the most of this, from the ambitious leaders. And that's why an earlier period, centuries earlier, of exactly that dynamic is what enabled the Manchu to come in and take over in the first place. Regional Chinese governments then fragmented the nation. And the central government of this new Republic of China disappeared in all but name. So it's a Hobbesian war all against all, and to see who wins and who gets control of China. One of those warlords was the leader of what he called, a new political party called the National People's Party, the Kuomintang. Now, of course, Chinese is a completely different alphabet, but rendered in Western, phonemes, it would be K. One of the spellings is Kuomintang, the National People's Party. His name was Sun Yat-sen. Lived from 1866 to 1925. His senior military advisor is one whose name is more familiar in the West because he lived longer, General Chiang Kai-shek. He lived from 1887 to 1975. They took over the nationalist cause in China, which developed in the next reign. The nationalists would take over China again after all this strife, because they fought among themselves, and then the winners, who would take over the nationalist cause, they took over China again and governed China as a republic, a nationalist republic, but very thinly disguised military dictatorship from 1928 until 1949, when the communists took over. But nothing just happens. No. Which introduces us to another of the competitors during the period of anarchy was the Chinese Communist Party, established in 1921 and joined in 1925 by Mao Zedong, who's the one who eventually led the communists to take over China, take China away from the nationalists in 1949. And that communist, and they still, Mao's creation still governs China. Mao himself lived from 1893 to 1976, so he died 4 years after Chiang Kai-shek. 1912, on April 14th, the Titanic sank, to connect this with more familiar history, in which 1,513 people drowned, owing to insufficient number of lifeboats. And because it took 2 hours to sink, if they had enough lifeboats, it's reasonable to conclude that maybe no one would have died. The wreck was discovered in 1985, the ship was in two pieces at a depth of 13,000 feet. And, of course, there's the movie, the famous movie. The following year, 1913, a guy who would change history in another way, named Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, was later, his followers that he later had called him Mahatma, which means the great soul. He was arrested for the first time in 1913. He lived from 1869 to 1948. A native of India, Gandhi pioneered a different form of nationalism. It was nationalism in the sense that, India was a colony at the time of Great Britain, so they were seeking independence. But his was a distinct form of nationalism by achieving it not by violence, not by civil war or uprising, as was going on in China at the time, but instead by applying the principle of ahisma, which means non-injury of any living being. So passive resistance. In 1906, he began translating this belief into the Indian passive, meaning nonviolent resistance movement to the British occupation. And for that, his first arrest was in 1913. After decades of effort, which included numerous beatings and more imprisonments, the movement succeeded in achieving independence for India in 1947. Gandhi himself ended up being disappointed in that it was followed by a partition of India into what was originally the non-contiguous Islamic nation of Pakistan to differentiate it from the Hindu majority of what remained India. And that non-contiguous nation was on both, so India comes to a point. And what we think of as Pakistan was on one side of the point, the western side of the point, but initially was also non-contiguous, but controlled the western side of on the other side of the eastern side of the point. But in 1972, East Pakistan became a separate independent nation of Bangladesh, and that still exists, with the rest of India still being majority Hindu. Gandhi had always wished for a Hindu-Muslim union in an independent India. Gandhi was assassinated in January of 1948 by a Hindu because Gandhi had made some statements against discrimination based on the caste system. But again, nothing just happened. So the breakup of the British Empire, we'd say 1913, his first arrest, that's definitely a historically identified, datable milestone in what would end up being the collapse of the British Empire after the Second World War. But nothing just happens. So it starts here. Same year, 1913, February 25th, in the United States, and this was connected to how and why the United States entered in the world stage and how it was able to enter the world stage, how it was able to afford it. It was able to afford it by looting from its own population. And because especially in the United States, we claim to revere the law. Nobody's above the law. So whenever the government wants to do something that's illegal and immoral, such as steal money from its own population, it fabricates a law. So then, then stealing in this case is not a crime because there's a law that says it can be done. So this brings us to the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, creating the federal income tax. February 25th, 1913. This ended the United States as a republic in the sense, I'll read it first and then it's there. So the complete text, quote, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration." End quote. So that's direct theft, now this wording the reason it was worded that way is because it violated the Constitution, the original Constitution. So this wording enabled the federal government to violate the original Constitution by using the amendment mechanism of the Constitution to say the opposite. So what it violated was Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 4 of the original Constitution, which read, quote, "No capitation," that's a head tax, "or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. So that apportionment referred to Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, Paragraph 3, which stipulated population among the states as the basis for their proportional representation in the House of Representatives. So this legislation, the 16th Amendment, enabled the enabling legislation, which integrated it into the law, the statutory law of the country, was the Underwood Simons Act of 1913, which implemented a 1% tax on incomes over $3,000 a year and a graduated surtax on incomes over $20,000 a year. That sounds modest, doesn't it? Only 1%. Well, 3 years later, the Revenue Act doubled the basic tax from 1% to 2% and the surtax from 6% to 13%, and added a death tax, which is a graduated estate tax of an additional 10%. And then from there, it just kept expanding. So the key, the reason I say the Republic ended with the income tax, is that it inverted the relationship of the government to the governed. Now, I'll go in more detail on this in the American history course, but the short answer, so that with the government now giving itself the right to directly steal, to directly confiscate money from its own people, and if those people refuse, then the government grants itself the right to take the liberty of that person, to imprison them, incarcerate them, and then steal their property anyway. That reversed the relationship. So instead of the government of a republic caring for the public things of the people, then the people are now subordinate to the government, in a command relationship, with punitive coercive power being applied. So it completely reversed and therefore ended the whole idea of a republic, and it just became an oligarchy. That's because of this. And so the reason I mention it in the context of the First World War is the vast looting of its own population, of the United States, the government looting its own population, filled its treasuries, which is what enabled it to create the kind of military that facilitated the involvement of the United States in the two world wars, and that brought it to the status of global influence, where we intervene in everything, because somehow Earth is our responsibility. None of that would be possible without the looting, of our own population, which this enables. So 1913, nothing just happens. Okay, same year, 1913, another step down toward the First World War was a war in the Balkans, triggered by Bulgaria invading Thrace and stealing it from the Turks, who had previously stolen it from the Thracians. Bulgaria, after that victory, then attacked Serbia and Greece. So Russia declared war on Bulgaria because Russia was allied with Serbia, so declared war on behalf of Serbia. With Russian backing, Serbia then invaded Albania, and Romania and the Turks intervened. So the war ended with a treaty at Bucharest in Romania on August 10, 1913, the terms of which pleased no one, so another conflict was inevitable. Following year, June 1914, the Habsburg rulers of Austria, after the unsatisfying end of that war, the Balkan War, which caught them by surprise, wished to assert their dominance in the Balkans, and they chose Serbia as the target to do this. So they planned to conduct military maneuvers in Bosnia, territory which Austria occupied a few years earlier, but which Serbia had always claimed as being part of Serbia. For these maneuvers, the heir apparent of the Austrian Empire, so analogous to the Prince of Wales in England, in this case it was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would attend these maneuvers as a royal observer and bring along his wife, Sophie. Few actions could be more insulting to Serbian national pride at a time when ethnic nationalism, the desire for ethnic independence, was so active in everybody's mind, so prominent in everybody's mind. So few actions would be more insulting than a foreign power, especially the hated Austrians, holding military maneuvers in territory that Serbia claimed, which shared part of its border with Serbia. So in reaction to this, a radical Serbian group calling itself the Black Hand had sympathizers in the Serbian government who leaked the itinerary of the Archduke to them. An ambush was then prepared, in which the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo by a member of the Black Hand named Gavrilo Princip on June 28, 1914. So that's killing the heir apparent to Austria. That would be like, killing the Prince of Wales in England. The ruler, the Austrian emperor, still Franz Joseph, whom we first met after the revolutions of 1848, as it happened, he despised Franz Ferdinand, the assassinated heir, his nephew. Franz Ferdinand was the nephew of Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph, the emperor, had a very tragic life. His own wife had been assassinated by an anarchist. His own brother, Maximilian, had accepted the title Emperor of Mexico, only to be defeated and executed by Benito Juarez. I'll cover that more in the American history course. His son, Franz Joseph's son, who was originally the heir apparent, contracted syphilis from a depraved lifestyle, and in its tertiary stage went insane and committed suicide after murdering his lover of the moment. So this left Franz Joseph with his nephew, his oldest nephew, Franz Ferdinand, as the heir apparent. Franz Joseph consistently, steadfastly refused to abdicate despite his advancing age. He was born in 1830 because he knew his nephew to be a political liberal who would make changes which Franz Joseph feared would end the Habsburg monarchy. And in a way, Franz Ferdinand did end the Habsburg monarchy, though not in the way Franz Joseph feared. But regardless of the emperor's personal feelings, Austrian pride could not allow the assassination of the heir to go unpunished. Fearing that Austria would use this as a pretext to invade Serbia, Serbia appealed to its ally Russia for help, which was plausible since Russia had helped them in the Balkans War only the previous year. Which brings us back to Nicholas II. In the supreme folly, in a lifetime filled with daily acts of stupidity, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, declared publicly, and through his ambassadors let the great powers of Europe know, that the Serbs were Slavic brothers, and Russia would not stand by and allow them to be crushed by Austria. Austria had an ally, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire for that matter. Now, Germany didn't care who ruled Serbia, but Germany could not allow Austria to stand alone against Russia, because Austria was Germany's only remaining ally, firm ally in Europe. So the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, the same guy who triggered the naval arms race, informed the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph that no matter what, Germany would fight beside Austria. So in history books of the period, this is called the blank check, the carte blanche. This caused the overlapping of two previously separate constellations of constructs, the diplomatic construct and the military construct. Diplomatically, the nations on both sides were enmeshed within alliance systems that required all members of the alliance to wage war if any one member of the alliance was attacked. The other construct, previously separate but now overlapping, are the war plans, the military war plans, all of which were time sensitive because of the dependence on railroad to transport large numbers of troops. And the clock on all the war plans was triggered the moment that a potential enemy mobilized. Once a potential enemy declared that their army was mobilizing, the clock starts. And so the other side has to mobilize. The practical consequence of this situation, as I mentioned earlier, I think in the previous video, was that if any one of the great powers mobilized their military, then Germany had no choice but to invade France. But it couldn't invade France directly across the border because of the fortifications. So in order to meet the timetable, it had to get to France through Belgium. Now, Belgium was a neutral country, so its borders were not fortified. But invading a neutral country like Belgium was a crime, a crime. But anyway, that's what the war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, called for. Germany had to invade France and get to it by invading Belgium, even though neither France nor Belgium had any stake at all in the Balkan conflict between Serbia and Austria. Nevertheless, in the single decision, one decision by one man, that brought the civilization of European monarchies to an end, Nicholas II mobilized Russia, ordered the mobilization of Russia in defense of Serbia. Germany then had to instantly put the Schlieffen Plan into effect and mobilize themselves and commence the invasion of Belgium in order to get to France. Appalled at this unbelievable act of stupidity, England, nevertheless, was trapped itself by its alliance, by the Triple Entente that it signed with France and Russia. So it felt obliged to declare war in support of its allies against the criminal invasion by Germany against two nations which had not even threatened it, and one of which was neutral, Belgium. So with all of this, the First World War began on July 28th, 1914, exactly 1 month to the day after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. As the spiral was reaching, the point of combustion, Pius X begged for calm, deliberation, and peace, but the merging of the alliance systems with the war plans did not permit time for such activities. Pius was ignored, and the West jumped into hell. Pius died 1 month later, August 20th, 1914, after a reign of 11 years and 16 days. He was followed by the war pope, Benedict XV. And we will turn to him in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.